On the podcast tonight from the Jays Journal and FanSided, helping us break down the Jays as they enter the home stretch for their push towards the playoffs. We've got Tyson Shushkewich. How are you doing tonight, sir?
I'm doing very well, thank you.
Perfect. So just under 20 games left in the season for the Blue Jays, and they currently sit second in the AL East. Now, they've had their ups and downs. They currently hold one of the wild card spots, 6.5 games back of the Yankees. We're taping this on Thursday night. And is this kind of where you had the Jays pegged preseason? Is it higher, lower, or are they about what you thought they would be at this point of the season?
I think going back to the preseason, going back to, spring training and everything that the Blue Jays did in the off season and everything that, the Matt Chapman trade, the Kevin Gausman signing, even though they lost Robbie Ray and Marcus Semien, I was fully on the Blue Jays hype train thinking that it was, AL East, top of the AL East or nothing, right? Like this was their year to really stamp out their mark in the division. Guerrero Jr. coming off the MVP campaign, Bo Bichette led the league in hits. So I think I don't want to say disappointed. Disappointed is not the right word because obviously baseball's a cruel game sometimes. And the Blue Jays not being in first isn't the biggest deal in the world because they're also within that playoff picture still. And
Right.
Obviously I would take first place in a heartbeat. But at the same time, the Yankees had such an incredible start to the year. We know the Blue Jays have been a little bit streaky this, they've gone through a manager change. They've had troubles with the fifth starter. They've had all these kind of ups and downs, and they're still fighting within that wild card spot. And I think I don't want to say disappointed, but I also don't want to say pretty impressive because I think they could have been a little bit further along, contending for that top wild card spot. But at the same time, you don't want to take away what they've accomplished because they have 5 hitters that have 20 home runs or more. Kevin Gausman and Alek Manoah have been contending for the Cy Young. They've been in that conversation. And I think this Blue Jays team has a lot, they're in a tough division, right? And I think this Blue Jays team has a lot of talent and they have a lot of things going for them that if they can get on that roll over the next, couple of weeks before the end of the season, secure that playoff spot, know that they're going to make it, whether it's in first, second, or third in the wild card. Maybe they get on their high horse and take the AL East. That'd be fantastic, but maybe a little bit out of the realm. But you never know, right? And they still have to face the Yankees and the rest of the AL East. So things could happen. And all they need is just an opportunity. And I think they've put themselves in a really great spot to seize that opportunity. But on the flip side, they also have the opportunity to squander it away, right? Like they could go on a losing streak here and Orioles catch up and it's all over. So It's in their hands. I think they have expectation wise, I think they're definitely there, right? And we were hoping for playoffs, and right now that's where they are. So definitely it's going to be a very exciting couple weeks. That's for sure.
That's all you got to do, right? Just get in. Crazier things have happened. Who knows? 6.5 games. We've seen the Yankees in free fall, and they seem to have righted the ship a little bit here. But you're also talking to a Red Sox fan here, so the fact that you're saying, "Oh, well, it wasn't the season we thought it was going to be. I thought they would be at the top." Well, things could be worse. Things could be worse in the AL East. There.
That's true. True. A lot of them could be hurt, bicycle accidents and pending free agency.
At this point, it's just you could literally come up with any headline when it comes to Chris Sale and his health, and I would believe it at this point. He's clearly broken a few mirrors and walked under ladders in his time. But getting back to the Blue Jays here, assuming they do make the playoffs, and let's say it is a wild card game, looking at the teams that are still frisky and could move into one of those wild card spots, and depending how the standings end up shaping up, is there someone who you're kind of hoping, okay, if we've got to do the whole wild card route here, I wouldn't mind it being against this team based on who is currently in the running there. Is there anyone this year, or do you think it's pretty balanced amongst those teams in contention?
Well, I think when you look at the big picture, right? Let's hypothetically, let's say the Yankees and the Astros get the first bye, right? Let's hypothetically just say AL Central is the third team. They have to place number 6, 4 versus 5. I think when you look at the big picture, right, it really, there's a couple of teams that I think the Blue Jays would probably like to avoid. One of them being the Seattle Mariners. But there's a bit of a flip to that, right? The Seattle Mariners have a really strong pitching core that they're going to throw out there with the rotation, right? With who they have. And they also have, deadly bats in there. Like the Julio Rodriguez is, fantastic. The lineup is deep. They bested the Blue Jays this year in the season series. And if they have to go to Seattle and play them, let's say, for the Blue Jays end up where they are now and the Mariners finish where they are now, like that's a tough series, right? Because, the Blue Jays fans will likely come down in droves. So I won't say it's a home field advantage, but the representation will likely be there. But you're facing a starting rotation that's probably one of the deepest in the American League. And, as we saw today when they faced Shane McClanahan, like, these pitchers can give the Blue Jays troubles. At the same time, they've also tagged Garrett Cole for lots of runs in games before. So, it's come and go. But at the same time, if you look at the season stats, the Blue Jays lost to the Mariners, right? And that's potentially something you want to avoid. But on the flip side of that, something that we noticed from earlier in the year when the Blue Jays played the Mariners is one of their starting pitchers didn't come to Toronto.
Yeah.
Right. Now, placed on the, Ray, when Robbie Ray got placed on the restricted list, maybe it's, is vaccination question in hand? Who knows? Maybe alternative motives. Who knows? You can kind of connect the dots, but you don't want to, assume, if you will. Yeah. Right. But if the Blue Jays play the Mariners at home, right, and they end up fourth and the Mariners have to come visit, that kind of tips the scales, right? Because the Rogers Center in a playoff atmosphere is absolutely phenomenal. It's huge. It's loud. It's, crazy things happen and the Blue Jays get on board. And now you potentially don't have to face, Robbie Ray. Maybe he did get vaccinated and this is all irrelevant and who knows, right? But it's one of those things to consider that could really tip the scales in the Blue Jays' favor if they have to go to 3 games, right? Which is totally possible. Yeah. I think another series you want to avoid too is facing Tampa at Tropicana. The Blue Jays don't have a great track record at Tropicana. Not a lot of people like Tropicana Field, and with the past week that we saw, it's definitely one team could win. It's a bit of a toss up when you go into those games. That the Rays have a great bullpen. They have pesky hitters that'll just hit the home run, but then drop the little one in front of you. They have a talented team, and I think with Tampa, the Blue Jays playing Tampa would be a great series. You just want to avoid playing them at home. Or with the Rays being home, right? You want to avoid that as all possible. Yeah, and if they play them at the Rogers Center, maybe a lot of Blue Jays fans will go down there for almost like a spring break, and you can fill it up. But it's just history has not been on their side in Tropicana Field. They lost to them in the wild card in 2020. So maybe you want to avoid that, right? But I think. Either way you spin it, the Blue Jays playing someone, maybe if they end up 6, that might be beneficial to them. They have to play whoever won the AL Central, right? And maybe that benefits, even if you're on the road, right? Who knows? You could, insert this team, and pros and cons either way. And maybe that's the beneficial, just because the AL East, they play a lot of each other, but to the end of the season. But then they also have to, depending on where they go, there's. Like I said, you go to Tropicana, it's going to be a lot riskier than if you had to go to Seattle. But if you welcome to both teams, you're doing okay. So definitely, it's not the easiest question to answer, and I don't usually make easy answers. Usually they're pretty long and drawn out, and I got to get cut off. But essentially, there's so much at play here that there's any way you spin it. I think as long as the Blue Jays can get in, they'll kind of deal with it from there. But definitely, I think the AL Central opponent would be great to face. The con being you'd have to play on the road, and you want to avoid going to Tropicana at all costs.
Yeah. Well, I want to circle back as well, too, to something you mentioned off the top, which, shouldn't just be glossed over here as well, is the fact that they did have a manager change midseason, right? Charlie Montoyo gets fired in July. John Schneider comes in, and now that we've at least got kind of a decent sample size of, what the Jays look like under his management and his leadership there, what's just been your overall impression of, the Charlie Montoyo era versus the second half of the season under Schneider now?
When I think when you look at the big picture, Montoya, when he was hired, was the right guy for the job, because he was incorporating a team that was, on the younger side. They were going through the rebuild back in 2019 there, and that club needed his guidance. He had worked, he came up through the Rays organization, and he had never been a major league manager before. But I think he was the right guy for that role. And as time went on, the feeling kind of around the Blue Jays was he was a little bit, I don't want to say lackadaisical, but he wasn't as up in your face. He had made some risky bullpen decisions last year. He wasn't doing that so much this year. He was, there. I can't really point back to a game where it was like, Charlie Montoyo's decision blew this game, back in this series, right? But at the end of the day, you could kind of see a shift in when they went through that West Coast slump there, where the feeling had left the room that, Montoya just wasn't the right guy for the job anymore. And when the Blue Jays made that move to Schneider, I think it was a move that a lot of people saw coming. And Schneider has been in the Blue Jays organization for a very long time. He's pretty much won at almost every level that he managed throughout the Blue Jays organization. He managed, a lot of these younger players when they were in the minor leagues. And I think that speaks volumes, because he, like I said, the history was on his side with how he was doing. The records were on the side, and he was winning, he won championships. He won Eastern League Manager of the Year in Double-A. Like, he was just doing well. And it wouldn't even be surprising if, let's say, Montoya never got fired. It wouldn't be surprising if Schneider was coveted for jobs this offseason for other teams. So with Schneider, I think the Blue Jays, they definitely make a lot more riskier decisions. The hit and run has gone up exponentially with him in charge, and he's made a few, I wouldn't say costly mistakes, but I would say he's made a few decisions that are kind of like, oh, you're leaving in, so and so for another batter. Okay, maybe I wouldn't do that. And there's been a few occasions where it's like, oh, and that's why we didn't do that. But at the end of the day, I think the Blue Jays really turned a corner with him coming in. They definitely incorporated some things in their game that I think fans were looking for when it comes to, the hit and run and stealing bases and, juggling the lineup even, right? Like he was not, Schneider came in and moved some players around, and, they started winning some ball games. And with Montoya, you didn't really see that as much. Now, whether or not that was his decision, but I think this team under Schneider's is definitely trending in the right direction, especially with, how they've been playing lately, as well as who they have to face moving forward.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, they definitely seem to have a lot more versatility underneath Schneider and are willing to take those risks, as you mentioned there. And, when you're looking at this lineup as it's currently constructed, there's obviously been injuries that have sort of shuffled around, the starting rotation, bullpen, even some of the hitters throughout the season here. And what kind of stands out to me, though, is just the depth that the Blue Jays seem to have this year, which maybe in the, Donaldson, Bautista years, they didn't really have, right? Like, if you look at the New York Yankees, for example, like Aaron Judge is dragging them to the playoffs. Like, were it not for his, heroics at certain points of the season, we could be talking about the Yankees not even being in the postseason picture right now. Like, that was how bad that free fall was. Whereas you look at the Blue Jays and, one night it's Vladdy, next night it might be Bichette, the next night it might be Springer, could be Kirk, could be Gossman. Like, just seems to be a different person who's stepping up every night. So when you're looking at this roster, clearly Aaron Judge, MVP of the Yankees right there. Who's the team MVP right now for the Toronto Blue Jays?
I think right now, that's a bit of a tough question, because I think you kind of covered it really well when you said, this night it's Bo Bichette right now is having a fantastic September and is probably won game MVP for half of the games this season, like half of the games this month, right?
Mm-hmm.
But then you have, Matt Chapman hits this clutch home run, and his defense has been fantastic this year. And then you have the Gausman and Manoah, and even Kirk, right? Alejandro Kirk is having a great season as well. And I think this year, I think the MVP, if I had to give the MVP award, I think it would be Alek Manoah.
Mm-hmm.
And the reason I say Alek Manoah is because, and this, I think coming into this year was his big test, right? You were seeing a pitcher who was going to, hypothetically, he was going to be the guy he's pitching the most innings he's ever pitched in his career, hypothetically. He's a guy that pitchers and other teams had seen now. They had more data on him. He was coming in with, I don't want to, not a chip on his shoulder, but people knew who he was, what he was capable of. Now they had more game film on him, and he was going to be the guy that the Blue Jays needed to depend on this year, right? Like they had Barrios starting off the year. He had the extension, that was great. They had Gosman, oh, that's great. And then they had Ryu and Kikuchi, and then Manoah was in there, in the middle of the rotation there to kind of help balance it out. And as the season progressed, you saw, with Barrios, with his inconsistencies, Kikuchi has just been
a train wreck.
Having a rough year. We'll go with having a rough year, yeah. And then Ryu, getting hurt. I think, we saw Manoah step up, right? He's always, when you look at his overall stats on the year, he's just, the guy just goes out there and it's just an animal, right? He can be a bit wild, and we know that, and we know that he'll hit batters on occasion, but he's just not afraid to go out there and do his absolute best. And I think what kind of cemented that for me is his last start here, where he was up at 2 a.m. He was almost ready to go to the hospital because he couldn't keep fluids down. Like, he was just not doing well. He didn't start the first game of the doubleheader, but then he came out for the second one and just pitched an absolute gem, right? And I think when you look at a player, he's like, and I can't remember the quote exactly after he played, but he was basically like, my job, is not to feel good. It's to go out there and pitch well. Whatever that looks like, I have to go out there and do that. And, we see him go deep into games, and he's so much energy on the mound, right? Like when he got earlier this season, he was in the 8th inning, and you basically had to rip the ball out of his hand because he didn't want to leave that badly. Like, he had so much passion and energy for it. I think if you look at a player who, you look at a player who's really changed your season, Alec, batting aside, because you obviously see the impacts of, when they scored 27 runs, right? Or 29 runs or whatever. You see that on the field, right? So many players hit well. Kirk has a 300 average, but then you look at overall quality starts, who's kept the Blue Jays in these games when they needed someone to go deep that day, who was able to do it, who went and pitched, the game in New York under the bright lights. It always goes back to Manoah.
Yeah. Now, there's kind of two ways that you can look at it right now, right? Like we just mentioned that depth piece, which, the Blue Jays have gone into the playoffs before, and maybe they were a little bit more top heavy and didn't result in those World Series rings that they were hoping for under the Donaldson and Bautista days and all of that. Now they're maybe a little bit more balanced, but in that same sentence we were using to describe, and we also described a lot of inconsistency as well too, right? Like you don't know who's the guy that's going to step up tonight, who's hot, who's cold, and everyone has kind of had those ebbs and flows this season. Now, hopefully that means everything's going to come together in October, but are you more worried about their inconsistent play, or do you like that depth more? Like which end of that spectrum would you fall on when you're looking at this roster and how they're trending towards October and postseason baseball right now?
I think if you look towards how they're trending right now, I think the depth is something great to have, because with that you do have the potential that someone's going to stick out and do that for you. But at the same time, having that, let's say like an Aaron Judge type, like let's say Vladimir Guerrero Jr. was having the season like he is this year, right? If you had him and everyone else was down a little bit, like you would see his contributions more. And maybe that's a bit concerning, because, for example, when you look back to 2020, they got bounced out by the Rays, and they didn't really have, Vladdy was the guy, but they also still had, a little bit of depth to them. They kind of squeaked into the playoffs, and it showed, right? And I think now that they have more of that depth, because when we say depth, it's a good mix of depth, right? Because you have your veterans like Gosman and Springer, and then you also have your younger side, who's Bichette and Guerrero, and you're seeing these teams these players contribute, whether it's they hit the walk-off home run, or they got 2 for 4 that day, or Jackie Bradley Jr.'s in center field today because Springer's hurt, but he's made 3 fantastic plays in center field. That's what keeps them in the games. And I think one thing that's interesting to note is if they were to reach the postseason, they can really shuffle around the pitching, right? I think that's really key, because right now the big thing for the Jays is, tomorrow they got to throw out a bullpen day because they don't have a 5th starter, right? And that really screws with the consistencies, because if they struggle tomorrow, like that impacts the whole weekend. They got to make a move, they got to do something, right? But when you go to the postseason like that, you can, move 3 starters, move to that 3 starter, put Ross Stripling in the bullpen if you have to, or if you move Barrios to bullpen, you can boot Kikuchi out and have, you can even boot out, let's say Richards, he was pitching well. Maybe he struggled over the last little bit. You can boot him out and have someone else in there. Right. And I think that really provides a lot of depth to this team, which, like I said, we were talking about it there, that provides more depth in other ways that we haven't seen yet. And I think that will really benefit the Blue Jays, especially since, if you look at the playoffs now, a lot of starters don't go 7-8 innings. Yeah. They go 5 or 6, and, a lot of teams don't want them to see the lineup a third time. But if you can imagine, it's game 2, the Blue Jays won game 1, it's a 3-game series in the wild card, and you have, let's say Alek Manoah goes out there, he pitches 5 strong, and then you follow that up with Ross Stripling, and he goes out and pitches like he can, like you're setting yourself up to win. And that's where that inconsistency kind of comes in and scares you, because, Ross Stripling and Alek Manoah could throw a great game and only give up 1 run. But if the Blue Jays bats don't put anything on the board, like we've seen this year, they have 8 shutouts this year, then that's where that, that inconsistency really scares you. Right. But, I think what's most important for the Blue Jays right now is riding that momentum to finish out the season and then carrying it forward. Because we've seen them when they get on the hot streak, they can be downright unstoppable.
Yeah. Well, again, an interesting point right there, as far as there's obviously ebbs and flows, and such is the nature of a 162 game season, right? You're going to go through this. It's not like it's, the NFL, you got 16 games and, every game has added importance and whatnot. But if you're looking at this team as they inch towards the playoffs here, in your heart of hearts, are you more confident in the direction that their pitching is going in or their hitting? Because you mentioned it right there, and we've seen it a couple of times, even in the last couple of weeks there, the bats have just gone to sleep a couple of times, right?
See, I want to say pitching, but then you look at today and they gave up, they lost 11-0. So it's kind of, but I think I stick with the pitching. And, because when you look at this overall week that they've had, going back to not this last Monday, but the one before that, they had a doubleheader against the Orioles on the road, and they won both of them. They don't have a 5th starter right now that they could really depend on. They've, had quite a few games in between here and going into this weekend against the Orioles. They've had to do 2 doubleheaders. They've had to utilize their bullpen in different ways. They've needed their starters to go deep in games, and for the most part, they've done that. And I think right now the pitching for the Blue Jays is something that you definitely have the depth, the depth and more confidence in right now. Obviously, let's say today's outlier aside, right? Because a couple guys got tuned up for runs that you haven't normally seen from this past couple of months, right? And so when you look at the overall picture of it, it's the Blue Jays pitching has been more of their consistent right now, right? As of late. Not so much earlier in the year. They made some off-season or trade deadline moves that really helped them with Bass and Pop, and even Mitch White. He had a couple good starts before he was kind of started to struggle. And I think when you look at that, compared to the Blue Jays lineup, we know the Blue Jays lineup can score 29 runs. I think at that point we just need to see a little bit more consistency, because if we even look at this past week, that doubleheader that they had on the Tuesday, they lost the first game. They only put up 2 runs, but then they won the second one where they got 7. And then they went to Texas and they struggled a little bit. Like it's finding that consistency that would be great. But at the same time, if they're running a hot streak going into October where they're putting up a bunch of runs, that's where that changes. But at the same time, if you're going to look at the big picture, if you will, the Blue Jays, we know we can put up runs, but their pitching right now has been more steady.
Yeah. That's the second time you've brought up now the near 30-run game against my Red Sox. I'm doing my best to just put this out of my memory right now. You're bringing my demons back for me here, Tyson.
It's what it is. It's that game sticks out obviously because it's a lot of runs, but it was because at the time I was watching it, and I had an article tuned up, and it was like, okay, because they had already broken Blue Jays franchise history, and it was like, okay, do I have to change it to like league history at the time? Because at the time it was like, something unprecedented, right? Like, okay, we can go back to we can use the example of when the opening day when they had to come up by like 7 when Jose Barrios could get out of the first inning.
Yeah.
Texas Rangers always a fun subject with the Blue Jays.
Yeah. No, I tried to tune it out after they got to a dozen runs there, and then I was like, oh wow, they're just running away with this here. They could get to 40 tonight. So.
I just remember that game. I remember that game because of I think it was the Devers. Was it the pop-up? I think in the infield there. That's what set the whole stage for it. I can't remember.
Oh yeah, there was a comedy of errors there. Not only like you mentioned, right? It wasn't just the fact that we hit 25 home runs that night. It was a lot of self-inflicted wounds by the Red Sox there, and booting the ball around and playing more soccer than they were baseball. But
hey, they're still, you know what? The Red Sox always a dangerous team on the bats, right?
Yeah.
Like JD Martinez, like that Martinez and Bogarts and Devers. That lineup's scary any day, especially with how Bogarts is playing right now.
Wow. We could do a whole rabbit hole episode on things that the Red Sox need to do this offseason there. But I mean, getting back to the Blue Jays, I do want to talk about the fact that you did bring up, the trade deadline and how there weren't really any splashy names or big headlining all-stars coming over. And, that kind of irked a certain population of Blue Jays fandom right there. But now that you've seen the contributions that the pieces that they did bring in, those sort of depth pieces there, the Basses and some of the bullpen help and whatnot, what is your overall impression of how that trade deadline went down? Do you think they're going to have a little bit of maybe buyer's remorse in the sense of they didn't do enough? Or do you think that, they didn't empty the cupboard as far as their prospects go, and that'll actually serve them to keep that window to compete open longer with this core than had they pushed everything into the middle of this year and maybe gotten some guys who would be leaving in the offseason anyways?
Yeah, the offseason or the trade deadline, sorry, that was a weird time because I think a lot of the teams this year, the Castillo trade, that one initially hurt because it was like, okay, well, the Mariners, you're fighting to nail a wild card with the Mariners right now, and they just got a really good pitcher, but man, did they give up, quite a haul for them. And because last year the Blue Jays had the Jose Barrios trade, and that was one of the top 3 trades at the deadline, right? And I think at the initial time, a lot of the Blue Jays fans, the 3 wish list things were we needed someone who threw 100 in the bullpen. We needed another starter, and we needed a left-handed bat. And when you looked at the end scorecard, if you will, it was like, okay, well, you got a bullpen guy. He doesn't throw 100, but he's doing pretty well. And you had, Zach Pop, who he throws 98, but he's not having, I don't want to say bad season, but he's not striking guys out. He's definitely, ground ball, fly ball guy. Contract control is great. The Blue Jays front office, loves that. And then you got Mitch White, who the Dodgers fan base was a little upset when he was gone because he has that Ross Stripling 2.0 potential. And same thing, he has contract control. And I think the big one was Whit Merrifield, because at the time, no one knew his vaccination status, right? Because earlier by the All-Star deadline, it was like he was one of the 10 players who didn't come, and you just traded for him. And then the Blue Jays management followed that up by saying, we haven't actually talked to him yet to know if he is, right?
Right.
And it was like, and everyone's like, okay. And then I think what hurt too was when you looked at all the trade rumors, it was like the Blue Jays were in on Frankie Montas and they didn't get him. They were in on Noah Syndergaard and they didn't get him. They were, tied to Raisel Iglesias, who was that, strikeout guy already. Maybe not so much touching 100, but he was that strikeout guy they needed, and they didn't get him. And Jose Jimenez didn't get traded. Barlow didn't get traded. Like all these guys that the Blue Jays fans had their hopes on either didn't get traded or didn't come to the Blue Jays. And then you saw the Marlins deal and you're like, ooh, could they, get Pablo Lopez? Could they get Pablo Lopez? And the first thing I think it was Ken Rosenthal said was Pablo Lopez is not part of this deal. And so everyone is kind of like, oh, but I think with the Blue Jays, the initial disappointment was we didn't get the flashy guy, but also all these teams that were fighting for playoffs got better. And the Blue Jays got some depth, but at the time it was like, yeah, okay, it wasn't the 100-mile-per-hour guy would throw. And now when you look back, it's like, well, Anthony Bass has been absolutely fantastic. Like he's been the second guy. He's kind of like the Jimmy Garcia that we had, where he's the guy that we could trust right before Jordan Romano. And now you have Anthony Bass in that conversation as well, right? Like to use him in the middle relief innings will make Blue Jays fans upset because he can come out and shut down when you need. And Zach with Pop, unfortunately, he got number crunched because he had the options, but now he's back up, and he was doing all right, and kind of in the middle of the pack there, that middle relief arm. And Mitch White was good for when Kikuchi was starting to struggle and they moved into the pen. Now it's a little bit different. And, I think, could the Blue Jays have done more? Probably, right? And we'll never know the behind the scenes stuff where, maybe they were in on Ian Happ, but the Cubs wanted something too crazy and it never happened. But, when you look at this Blue Jays lineup, they have a lot of talent. And to think, to look at it right now, they don't even have a spot for Gabriel Moreno to play on a regular basis, and he's one of the top prospects in baseball. So overall, you just don't know. You don't know the behind the scenes, but you also know, like, at the end of the day, the initial disappointment, I think, is really starting to wane, because not only are the Blue Jays, let's say, hypothetically winning, they're in that wild card spot. Bass is contributing. Whit Merrifield's had some clutch hits for the team when they needed it. That play at the plate in Minnesota with Gary Sanchez, like that turned that won them the game, right? And I think there will always be that could have done more. And I think when you look at the Blue Jays farm system, they traded Jordan Groshans. He was the 4th ranked prospect, and when he joined the Marlins, he became like number 12th to 16th or something. And did teams ask for one of the top 3 prospects? Maybe, right? And the Blue Jays said, no, we're not. That's not part of our plan. They're part of our overall goal over the next few years. Who knows, right? But that initial disappointment, I think, is definitely starting to wane, and that's a good thing, right? Because this Blue Jays team is what you have right now. There's nothing else that's going to happen until the end of the season, right? So definitely, I think, with especially Bass has just been the absolute, what we wanted from that deadline. That guy that can come out and shut down innings. He doesn't throw 100, but he gets the job done. And I think the Blue Jays fans are happy with that 100%.
Yeah. Well, we've spent a lot of time talking tonight about the AL East, and obviously 2 clubs going in different directions between the Red Sox and the Blue Jays there, but want to quickly get your opinion on the National League as well too. Now, let's take the Dodgers and the runaway freight train that they are off the table here. If you're looking at anyone not named the Los Angeles Dodgers in the National League, and you had to pick someone to be that World Series representative for the National League, who do you like with what they're doing down the stretch right now?
That's a tough one.
Dodgers is just such the easy answer right there.
It's such an easy. I don't know, because what I think what's so interesting too is the Mets and the Braves right now, right? Because with the Mets can be such a dangerous team, but then they also they kind of have that inconsistency too, where it's like, oh, like, hey, what are you doing here? And then the Braves, they were World Series champions, right? And you never want to count that. They obviously lost some pieces to it, but at the same time, they still have some weapons, and it's going to be really interesting. I want to say the Braves, because just you always want to kind of root for the World Series, the former World Series champion, because you're like, back to back, like, let's do it. Like, but I think it's definitely one of those 2. I think it's the Mets and the Braves are definitely, the Padres, same thing. They have such a great lineup that if they get in, you can see definitely the NLCS being Dodgers and Padres. I have to look at the charts. I don't know how that would pan out, but or if it's even possible. But basically, I think with that, I want to lean towards either the Mets or the Braves. I'm going to give two teams. I think whoever can kind of come out of that on top, whether one goes out without facing the other, however that shapes up, I think whoever comes out of there is the one facing the Dodgers.
There you go. Tyson, thank you so much for taking the time to sit down with us tonight. For all those that are listening that want to check out any of your articles or connect with you on social media, any of that good stuff, where are the best places to find you these days?
Yeah, for sure. So I'm on social media on Twitter at Tyson_MLB. And then we have a talented team over at Jays Journal. We're under the FanSided wing. I'm one of the co-editors with Chris Henderson, who's a very talented writer as well. And then the rest of our staff, we put out a lot of Jays content for anyone looking for something to talk about. And then I also do some contributions over at Just Baseball Media. So definitely, if you're looking for Jays content or AL East, those are 2 great sites to check out.
Beautiful. Go and check out all of Tyson's content. Amazing stuff that he and the team are putting out all the time. Tyson, we'll see how the Jays do down the stretch and where they end up slotting in, either in that wild card or who knows, complete Yankee collapse, which I wouldn't be upset about, to be honest with you.
Yeah, this could be a different conversation in coming months. We'll have to see.